Hello YouTube, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Lexi. Thank you for joining. So in today's video, I'm gonna call this like a kind of a rapid Q&A for commonly asked questions pertaining to prep. I did a recent poll on my Instagram and asked you guys what YouTube videos you guys like to see, and I actually got a lot of people that voted that they like more of the informative videos. So as always, I'm gonna always keep a good like hodgepodge and mix of videos on my channel just to cater to everybody. But in today's video, we're going to talk about commonly asked prep questions. So first one is going to be, what happens if you gain too much body fat or too much weight too quickly post-show? And I want to start off with this question. It's a little bit of a heavy hitter, and I feel very, I think this is also why as a coach, I am so passionate about clients, setting them up for success post-show, because post-show can be a hard time for any client. Like, I don't care if it's your first show or your 10th show. I made a post on my Instagram about shit they don't tell you about post-show last week, and it was probably my most shared post in a long time. And honestly, like, that's just because I think a lot of people resonate with the topic. So post-show is a hard time for a lot of people. And, I think that there is this issue where some people, they go off the rails the first couple of weeks. Let's say, they're 5'2" and they gain 15 pounds in 3 weeks. That's a lot of weight in 3 weeks. And then what happens is a lot of times those same people, they freak out thinking like, oh my God, I just lost all my progress that I made in prep. And then they want to diet again, like, coach, I just want to diet, get back down to my stage weight, and then we can reverse diet. But what I don't think people realize is that the weight you gain post-show, more oftentimes than not, that body fat, you can't just go into another diet and get it off, right? Your metabolism in your body is in absolutely no spot to do another diet coming out of prep. So essentially, like, I know this is kind of a scary thought and this is kind of some tough love, but the weight you put on post-show, like if you have a really bad post-show rebound and you gain 15 pounds in 3 weeks, you're not just gonna be able to go into another fat loss phase or diet to get that weight off. Like, the body is just probably not gonna be able to respond because you can't just go into another diet a couple weeks after a prep, right? So that's something that I encourage, competitors, and furthermore, if you're in prep right now, just keep that in mind, and that should be a good incentive for keeping you a little bit more regimented and on track post-show. So when it comes to gaining a lot of body fat post-show too, this is also why I know I am a coach, and this may make me sound biased, but this is why I'm such a big advocate for stick with your coach post-show, right? And honestly, I think a really good mindset to adapt is if you are a competitor and you are wrapping up your season, consider thinking like about the next 4 to 5 weeks post-show as being prep. Because I think sometimes when we think about, okay, I'm competing and now it's off season, right? That's when we get a little bit too lax with ourselves. And sometimes we give ourselves an inch and we take a mile. So sometimes I'll tell my competitors, I want you to think of the next 4 to 5 weeks post-show as being just like prep, because usually if you can hold yourself accountable and stick to the reverse diet plan for 4 to 5 weeks post-show, after that, like, you're gonna be past that state of any type of like rapid body fat gain. So that is kind of like my shortened answer. I could literally talk about this for so long, but that's kind of my shortened answer to question number 1 of what happens if you gain too much body fat post-show. Obviously, gaining body fat post-show is going to happen, and it should happen, right? You should not stay stage lean for forever. However, if we're talking like an accelerated amount of weight in a very short amount of time, that's kind of what I'm getting at in this question with my answer. Okay, so moving on to question number 2. This is a question I get all the time, and I actually believe that Paul, Evan, and I are going to do a whole podcast on this, on the Pro Physique Code very soon. But that is, Lexi, what are the differences between coaching an athlete who, let's say, is 22 compared to an athlete who's 54? And to be very honest, I think a lot of people think that there are more differences than there actually are when it comes to, like, let's say a prep approach, right? So if I'm prepping a client who's 22 versus a client who's 54, to be very honest, and I've coached now for 5 years, so I can use a lot of different experiences I've had, there is not a big difference between the prep approach with both athletes. Honestly, I think that there are pros and cons to each. Obviously, younger competitors tend to have a little bit, less muscle maturity, less muscle density, whereas older competitors most of the time have a little bit more of a lifting history. Therefore, their muscle density is a little bit better. But there's also, cons as people age, there are, sometimes some more hormonal imbalances. I have a lot of my clients, who are competitors who are, let's say, over the age of 45 or 50. A lot of them do endeavor some form of HRT, which I think can be a very beautiful thing for a lot of people, especially if it enhances that quality of life. But also with being, with having an older competitor, sometimes as, you're working with older athletes, I'm not, before anybody comes at me, I'm not saying like 50 is old, but when you are working with older athletes as a coach, sometimes too, older athletes have more of a dieting history, meaning their metabolic rate is a little bit more down-regulated because they've had so much of a dieting history, right? They've dieted a lot more compared to if you have an athlete who's, let's say, 22 and they've never dieted in their life. Well, generally they're going to respond very, very well to the diet because they have absolutely no dieting history. So I find that to be a big difference. But to be very honest, when it comes to the actual prep approach, like in terms of cardio, in terms of lifting, the prep approaches are not that different dependent on the age of the athlete. Sometimes with older athletes, yes, there are going to be some training restrictions or limitations. Maybe recovery is not going to be as quick. So those are some things we have to take into account. But truth be told, from a coach's perspective, it's not like the protocol for prep for an athlete who's one age compared to the other changes drastically. So that is question number 2. Question number 3 is, how do I pick my show, Lexi? So this is a pretty straightforward question. I feel like this is a question I get a lot from like first-time athletes, because I think some people are under the impression that like there are good shows and there are bad shows, and truth be told, that's like not really the case. However, I will say, like, as a coach, there are certainly shows that I would favor putting athletes in compared to others, basically just based off of like the show experience and how I know like the show to notoriously be run. But my best piece of advice is, if you are working with a coach, your coach should be able to kind of guide you and help you in picking out your first show, or even if it's not your first show, they should be able to guide you in picking out your show. Because obviously it's going to be dependent on the goal too. If your goal is to go to a national show, you want to make sure that you're picking a regional show that you can nationally qualify at. And a lot of times, like if you're going to go to a national show and try to turn pro, which I'll get to that in a sec, because that's another question, you probably want to get behind a judge at a regional show, like a Becky, like a Sandy, like a Tyler Mannion. Those are going to be the judges who are judging national shows. So it's very valuable to get behind them. But my short answer for this is going to be, talk with your coach. If it is your first show ever, I highly recommend choosing a show that's very local to you. That way you can minimize stress, minimize any travel. I think it's always just your best bet to choose a local show if you can. Segueing into my question number 4, and this kind of goes along really well with the question beforehand, but that is, how do I qualify for a national show? And furthermore, how do I turn pro? So every federation has slightly different guidelines for how you turn pro. So I'm going to specifically talk on the federation that I have the most experience with, and that is NPC. So first off, how do you get nationally qualified? Well, in order to do that, you need to compete at a regional level show and place top 2 within your open class. So you must place top 2 in your open class. Now, I will be very honest, just because you are nationally qualified and you place top 2 does not always mean you need to go to nationals. Some regional shows are going to be smaller than others. And honestly, sometimes, you're going to only get an open class of 3 or 4 people. And like, let's just say you're top 2. That may not mean you're ready for nationals, even though you are nationally qualified. So this is definitely something, even if you're nationally qualified, have that discussion with your coach of if you are truly ready to go to the national level. And if you are, well then yes, endeavor that route. And that is going to be how you turn pro. So you have to compete at a national show, and generally national shows are going to be a lot bigger than regional shows, a lot more competition. And every national show is a little bit different. So some national shows require you to get first place in your height class, and that's how you get a pro card. There are some national shows that only award the top 4 in the overall with pro cards. There are also other national shows that reward the top 2 in their height class with pro cards. So every national show is a little bit different, but essentially in order to turn pro, you basically have to be the best of the best at a national show. And there are about like 7-ish national shows a year. It's all on the NPC News Online website, so you can go there as a reference. But in a nutshell, that is 1, how you nationally qualify, and then 2, how you earn your pro card. Okay, next question, and this is like, I wish I had more of a specific answer for this one, but I do want to shed some light on it, is, Lexi, how long does it take to be a good competitor? Now, obviously that's a very relative term. Good can mean a lot of different things. Are we talking good competitor as in like, just looking like you belong on stage? Are we talking good competitor as if, you're good enough to go to nationals and turn pro? But I do think, and I've seen this kind of trend, I feel like a lot of especially newer competitors or underestimate how long it truly realistically takes to do well in the sport. And I share this because I think some people get really down on themselves, if let's say their first year of competing, they don't do super well, or they don't nationally qualify, or they don't go to nationals, like heaven forbid they don't turn pro in their first season. I think some people have this idea that like that's normal. And I'm not trying to be negative, or like I'm just being realistic. Like that is not very normal. I mean, that happens for some people and that's awesome. But my point is, if you start your season and you don't turn pro in your first season, that does not mean you did anything wrong, especially if you're starting this sport at a young age. I think what a lot of people don't realize too is like some people who may turn pro really easily, they may be a little bit older and have more muscle maturity in general, right? But how long it takes, I mean, obviously it's gonna have a lot to do with how dedicated you are, right? I mean, if you're somebody who is perpetually always goofing off in your off season and not taking it seriously, well, it's probably gonna take you a little bit longer to do well on stage. But if you are somebody who is locked in, you're working with a coach, you're maximizing all of your potential with training, with your nutrition, you're being intentful, you're probably going to acquire success with whatever that success means to you a little bit quicker. But my point with this clip is like, I just want to be very realistic and, tell people it, for a lot of people, takes years and years and years to get to where they want to be in this sport. So please do not be discouraged if, it takes you 1 to 2 seasons to get that desired result that you want to get. That is not unrealistic at all. I think sometimes social media makes us feel like we're behind or feel like we should be, winning our first show. But like, that's honestly, like, that's not as realistic as I think some people think. Is it impossible? No, but don't feel bad if you're not winning your first show, because that's not, that's not always going to be realistic. Last question. So this question is very person dependent as well, but I'm going to give a pretty good idea of like who this applies to and who this doesn't. And it is the question of, can you build muscle in prep? Because as a coach, one of the most common things, I think a lot of coaches can attest to this, is we get asked, or, usually when asking a client their goal, they're like, okay, I want to build muscle and lose body fat at the same time. And unfortunately, again, not trying to be like negative, I'm just being realistic. That's not going to be able to happen for a lot of people. So the question of, can you build muscle in prep? So to be just flat out honest, a lot of times, yes, you can build muscle in prep, but that's going to usually be if you are going the enhanced route. Of course, if you are an enhanced athlete, you are using PEDs, that's when, yes, you can see some muscle being built during prep. Now, it can happen naturally too, especially like I had a client recently, and she'll know who she is because I know she watches this channel, and she is newer to lifting. Her genetics are insane. She puts on muscle so quickly, and we were actually able to build muscle in prep naturally. Now, this is very, very rare. I would say this happens to maybe 5% of competitors. So generally, that's why I always say as a coach, an off season is so important, because that's where you build the physique. And then in prep, you're more so just kind of stripping down the body fat and revealing what you've built in the off season. So hopefully that clears up that question. But I am going to wrap up this video. It was super random with just a hodgepodge of some very common questions I get asked about prep. But if you guys like this style of video, let me know. It was just short, sweet, to the point. Hopefully you guys gained a little bit from it. And as always, all my discount codes and my coaching link for one-on-one coaching is below. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will catch you guys in the next one.